end of the chapter. We'll see if we get there or not. Again, just to remind you, we're looking at the fifth judge in this series. We had Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, and now Gideon. And Gideon takes the largest amount of space and time, verses, chapters, than any of the other judges. Samson comes close, but Gideon still beats him out. And I'm going to just kind of mention the outline again just briefly. When, of course, we look at the judge is Gideon. The children of Israel, we know, did evil in the sight of the Lord. But then after 7 years of oppression, they cried unto the Lord. The oppressor, and when they did evil, were the Midianites, but also the Amalekites and the children of the east. The chronology is that after they cried unto the Lord, well, I should say, after they did evil, they had 7 years of oppression. And if you remember, those 7 years of oppression were 7 years that the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the children of East would swing down through them every year at harvest time and basically take everything that they had. So it wasn't a constant oppression. They weren't constantly being managed by these hordes that were coming down. But it was worse, everything that they worked for, everything they did at harvest time, and we'll see that, they had to hide to be able to save it because of these nomadic raiding armies. And of course, again, 7 years of oppression and then 40 years of peace. And we're not going to deal with the application just yet because we'll do that as we go along. We looked at, too, the outline in chapter 6 of the whole outline. And we only got through because of dealing with all of the things I just summarized, and a lot of other stuff, and dealing with who Gideon was, what was his family. And we looked at the first 10 verses about the cycle of sin. And then tonight we're going to look at the call of Gideon, verse 11 through 27. We'll look at the casting down, which means when God told him to throw down the altar of Baal and to cut down the groves, and he did that. And then the clippings of wool, most of us, and I just use the C because simply that's what it was, the fleece of wool. It was what it had sheared off of the sheep, and they used that. We may or may not get to that point. We'll see how well we do. Let's get right into the call of Gideon, starting with verse 11. And this begins with Gideon hiding the harvest. And there came an angel of the Lord and sat under an oak which was in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash the Abi, and his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Now, there's a lot of drama that's going to build into this story. You don't see it just here, but in these next couple of verses, you're also going to pick up the angel of the Lord and the identity. And you're going to wonder about it, but it seems pretty clear to me that this is Jehovah. It is a theophany, what is called, where the Lord takes the shape, a form, and shows himself. You'll see it because it says in verse 14, Jehovah looked upon him. And it appears that this is a man who was of a common business and operating job, that he was a farmer. Basically, he was the lowest on the totem pole. Even in his father's house. And you can kind of imagine that this is not really a clean job. When I say that, we get the idea of just someone standing and kind of winnowing the wheat, the barley, or whatever that they're doing to get rid of the chaff that's there. But they're in this threshing the wheat, there's a lot of dust. There's a lot of dirt. You're going to get filthy by doing this. Just like when anybody is going to do farming, you're going to get dirt under your fingernails. You're going to get black on your hands. You're going to get dirty around your nose and every place else. So you can kind of get the gist. Here he is. They're hiding from the Midianites, and he is in particular, and he's threshing the wheat by the winepress, a place where they could remain hidden. Verse 12, we see the angel's appearance and assessment. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. Amen. We all like that, but you know, this is a big surprise to Gideon. It really is. These words really, it is a promise of victory, and it's a promise of might. But it's almost like Jehovah is saying, I'm with you, you brave hero. Really? Because look what he says next. Gideon's question of reason. He's basically going to get, if that's the case, then why is this happening? It's not an unfamiliar territory for a lot of us. But look at verse 13. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all his mercies which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hand of the Midianites. Well, this all posed a real problem to Gideon. And it is the first question that he asked after being called a mighty man of valor. That strikes him as an oddity. In other words, he's saying, if that's the case, if I'm so brave and I'm a mighty man of valor and you're with me, why am I hiding in this winepress? I mean, if you take a look at all the remaining texts and see if you can even find an answer to that question, because he does ask a question. Does he get an answer? Does the Lord say, well, the reason why? No, he doesn't. I want you to pay attention to that, because a lot of times you and I will ask, why, Lord? Why? Job asked the same thing. He did not get an answer. You need to trust the Lord. You know, no. And beside the fact, when you look at this, the Lord had not forsaken Israel. Not at all. In fact, God was fulfilling his promise to Israel. You go and look at, and I'm not going to put it up on the screen, but Psalm 89, verse 30 through 33, and I won't put it all up there, but the Lord is bringing the rod just like he promised. If Israel forsook his law, if they did not walk in his judgments, if they broke his statutes, if they would not keep his commandments, then he said, I will visit their transgression with the rod. That's what God was doing. God hadn't abandoned them. God hadn't forsaken them. God was correcting them. In fact, if you go to the next couple of verses in Psalm 89, verse 34 and 35, it says, Nevertheless, my loving kindness will I not utterly take, nor suffer my faithfulness to fail. I think a lot of times when we experience the chastening hand of the Lord, and I say the chastening because sometimes it can even be the scourging, but I think there's 3 levels of correction. That God rebukes us. If we don't listen to that, God chastens us. If we don't listen to that, God scourges us. And that's the pattern that God uses. But all of those are a product of God's love. They're not a product of God forsaking or despising us. But let's go a little bit further, and we do hear something. We hear in verse 14 the Lord's promise. Jehovah's promise. And let's look at this, because again, this is why it's very interesting. Verse 14. And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? Oh, before I get too far into that, and the Lord looked upon him, I wonder what kind of look that was. Now, I don't know about you, But I got all kinds of looks from my parents, depending on what I was doing. If it was something that they could be proud about, I got a look of joy, a look of pleasure. But if it was something wrong that I was doing, I got the evil eye. I got the eye that told me to knock it off. In fact, in church, there were plenty of times where I did not sit with my parents, but if I made noise too much, my father would look at me and give me that eye, and gave me a little clue that if I didn't stop, he was going to call me down right during the services, and I would have to walk from the back all the way to the front and sit on the front pew. That meant bad news for after church, too. What kind of look did he get? That last phrase that's there, have not I sent thee? It's kind of like, why are you questioning my orders? I mean, what power, too, was there in that look coming from those eyes? I can imagine that his look went beyond the surface of the situation and looked right into Gideon's soul. Two, it was a look that could communicate to him, this thy might. Go in this thy might, and the might of the Lord. Thy strength is Jehovah's presence, Jehovah's command. That is the Lord's strength, and that's what we need to understand for ourselves. The next you're going to see in verse 15 is Gideon's reluctance, or I could say Gideon's panic. And he said unto him, O my Lord, well, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. That's why I said there's more than just reluctance in the words of Gideon. We know what he does in trying to, put God to the test and trying him to make sure and confirm what he's really saying. But I think there's a little bit of panic when his mind begins to race on the, Lord, how in the world are you going to be using me? How is this going to be accomplished? That word wherewith is kind of the how, when, and why of the whole thing. How are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? And why in the world would you use me? That's what a lot of us think about what Moses said. I'm really not able to speak, and you want me to speak to the people of Israel? You want me to speak to Pharaoh? Why, I stutter. I can't really speak. And you can get the picture from Jehovah's responses, without saying it in so many words, that Moses, who made your mouth? Who knows you better than you do? You don't need any help. Nevertheless, I'll give you your brother to be a help to you. But this too, it also comes from a man. When you see this, I'm not going to knock him totally for saying it this way, because this is a man who owns his weakness. He owns his insufficiency and his helplessness. It's the very reason why he's hiding and he's not out there in public, so that he can be found and fight with the Midianites. No. He knew with what they were poor. They were needy. We can't afford to lose what we have. I'm no mighty man of valor. But then verse 16, the Lord's presence, and his promise, I will be with thee. And the Lord said unto him, surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. He's not talking about that he's the one man. He's talking about the Midianites being like one man. Now, think about that when you start measuring the size of the Midianite army to Gideon's army. Even when it's in full force at the front of the beginning of all of this, and how many he does have, they are still greatly outnumbered. And yet God's promise is, you're going to smite the Midianites as just one man. It's going to take one man. That's it. You cut that one down, and it's like as if they're gone. And then Gideon's petition in verse 17, show me a sign. And he does this a couple of times. In verse 17, he said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. Now, he is talking with him, right? That isn't hard to figure out, but he's asking for a sign. In other words, I want to be sure this isn't a vision, it isn't a dream. I'm not imagining this. Show me a sign. And he needed confirmation about who it was that was talking to him and that he had truly found grace. Again, you even think about Moses and his reservation when God told him, he asked, well, who should I say sent me? You tell him I am sent you. There is, again, not a lack of faith, but they want confirmation just like most of us do. It's not much different than the man who said, I believe, help thou my unbelief. We always have that problem. We still ask for confirmation of a call if God calls us to do a work. And that sign may not be anything physical. I mean, I'm sure I did it when I was a young man. I looked for signs, Lord, make a red VW Volkswagen run past me right now. Then I'll know. Didn't happen. But I've asked that. But the signs did come a lot of times upon my heart. And that sign may come upon our hearts, and not in some miraculous event, but it's a sign nonetheless that God puts upon us. And there are a lot of times, just as we heard even in the blessings tonight, you can see God's hand in things that happen. And that oftentimes is a sign of God's protection, God's provisions. In verses 18 and 19, we're going to see Gideon's presentation, which is again part of this sign that's here, where he presents cakes, flesh, and broth. And he asks for delay. First thing he does is depart not hence, kind of like, hang on, don't leave, I pray thee, until I come unto thee. Hang on, stay here, don't go away, let me go and bring forth my present. That's why I said it's his presentation. And set it before thee, and he said, I will tarry until thou come again. Now, we don't know how he prepared everything, but we got a pretty good idea. Look at verse 19. And Gideon went in and made ready a kid. We don't know if he killed the kid. We're talking about probably a goat here, or he took part of that. We don't know exactly, other than the fact that it talks about a broth, so it seems like he boiled the meat that was there, but he could have broiled it as well. But he made ready a kid and unleavened cakes of an ephah of flour. The flesh he put in a basket, and he put the broth, that's why I say it was boiled, the broth from the meat, in a pot, and brought it out unto him under the oak, and presented it. Now, he didn't do that just walking to the tent and turn around and walking back. There was a little time. There was a little delay. So that's why he told the angel of the Lord, depart not hence. Hang on. Here's what I want to do, and I'm going to make a presentation. Stay right here while I go prepare food. Did he get an answer? He must have, because it took time and he knew it would. This was to be presented as a gift to Jehovah, really a gift to God. Now what we see in verse 20 are the angel's instructions. And he tells him to lay him on a rock. And the angel of God said unto him, take the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and lay them upon this rock, and pour out the broth. And he did so. And what do we see from here? The angel's consuming fire. This is fascinating. Then the angel of the Lord put forth the end of the staff that was in his hand, and touched the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and there rose up fire out of the rock. And it consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. Gideon got his sign. The sign was that the sacrifice that he offered, the presentation, was consumed. It was accepted, and the miraculous part of this is that the angel, poof, disappeared. The angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. The rock, of course, is like an altar but it was one made by God. And the fire did again not come from above. There are plenty of times Elijah called for fire coming down from heaven. There are other times where fire comes down out of heaven, but this, the fire came up out of the rock. Very different. But again, Gideon understood his state of sin. And you see his perception that comes in next in verse 22. And when Gideon perceived that he was an angel of the Lord, Gideon said, Alas, O Lord God, for because I have seen an angel of the Lord face to face. He understood his own sinfulness. He understood that he was in a state of sin, though he was in a state of faith as well. But he understood the holiness of God. And he understood that no man can see God and survive. So he figured he was destined to be dead after that. If any did behold the glory of God, he was in trouble. Like most of us, we fear when God reveals himself to us in some way, and we know that we are not really worthy of such a glimpse. I mean, if we really think about it, and even though we don't see God's glory, but we see his hand in our lives in some way, and how he has protected for us, or protected us, or how he has provided for us, we know we're not worthy of that. And it is a real way for us to gain confirmation. But it is also acquiring a fear that must be answered, though it is not fully expressed. Because what happens? He looks for the Lord's peace, and the Lord does give him his peace in verse 23. And the Lord said unto him, Peace be unto thee. Fear not, thou shalt not die. So Gideon had that hesitation and that fear that he thought, oh no, I've seen the Lord, I'm going to die. But the Lord gives him confirmation. And these are words Gideon not only needs right now, but Gideon needs to remember these words, thou shalt not die. Because there's going to be some people come along in just a little bit. They want him dead. And he needs this. He needs these words now, and he will need them in just a little while. Remember, too, that the angel had just disappeared. Remember? The fire came out, and the angel disappeared. And we read, oh, I'm going to die. And the Lord said unto him, well, wait a minute, the Lord just disappeared. So where's the Lord now? Or did he just speak to him? Did he come back for that little moment? We don't know all of this. Was it just a voice that spoke to him in this particular place? But it was the very voice that he needed. It was the voice he needed to calm him. It was the voice he needed to gain assurance that he is safe and protected by Jehovah. And this gave him a great deal of peace. In fact, so much so, in verse 24, we see Jehovah's altar of peace. Then Gideon built an altar there unto the Lord and called it Jehovah Shalom, or Jehovah Peace. Unto this day it is yet in Ophrah of the Abrazarites. So he's there, it's there still today, memorializing this whole event. Now is when you get the command of the Lord's command, and he's going to tell him to do something that really is going to take a great deal of courage. There's also a point we need to know. Well, let's go ahead and read the verse in verse 25, and then I'll speak to us. It says, and it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him. Now again, remember, the Lord departed. But the Lord speaks to him. I have no doubt he spoke to him. Don't know all of the hows, and the angel seems to have disappeared. But he tells him, take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years old, and throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that is by it. So all of this that he's going to do is on his own property or his father's property. His father has allowed this altar of Baal to be there. His father has allowed the grove to be on their property. And the townspeople are involved in this and come to it on a regular basis. And so it is a well-known location. It is a well-known gathering location for those who are worshiping Baal. And then we see in verse 26 the Lord's conditions. What does he say? And he tells them, and build an altar unto the Lord thy God upon the top of this rock in the ordered place. Well, we don't know exactly what that ordered place, other than the fact that he seems to be making it very clear. Upon this rock, this is the ordered place. And take the second bullock, and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the grove, which thou shalt cut down. So it seems like he brought 2 oxen that were there, 2 bullocks. One was to be used in tearing down the altar, the other tearing down the groves, and the wood that was gathered from that, it was used to build another, not building the altar out of the wood, but he built another altar out of the rocks, and then with the wood he started the fire, which he used that to offer the second bullock. So it was an offering in the same location, generally, as where the altar of Baal was. Everything was torn down. Gideon was to use the wood of the grove to do this sacrifice. And so Gideon, though, you see, had a little anxiety. And I often wonder with that word, thou mighty man of valor. Again, what he must have looked like, trying to work with the wheat and making sure that they had some food for themselves, and being filthy, and yet here, not only filthy, but fearful. Look at what happened, verse 27. Then Gideon took 10 men of his servants, and did as the Lord had said unto him, and so it was, because he feared his father's household. Now remember again, that was his father's property, his father's area that he had given this to, and he feared his father's household and the men of the city, that he could not do it by day, that he did it by night. Now again, you might think that he has no courage, that he's a coward. I don't think so. But there's something to all of this, and it appears from this instance and from the following that these men were at these groves on a daily basis. They were regular in their worship of a false god. Because what happens? That's when we get into the casting down. And I'm about out of time, but we're just going to barely be able to get into this. But here's where you find the uproar over the destruction of the altar of Baal. Now, that ought to sound odd. That would be like us having some kind of idolatry out in the middle of our green area between the buildings out here, and an idol and the worship, and everybody knows it's wrong to do. Everybody knows it's against God's word, and when somebody goes and tears it down, somebody else gets all upset. So what happens? Look at verse 28. And when the men of the city arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was cast down, and the grove was cut down that was by it. And the second bullock was offered upon the altar that was built. Verse 29, and they said one to another, who hath done this thing? They started investigating right away, and when they inquired and asked, it wasn't hard to figure it out apparently. They said, Gideon, the son of Joash, hath done this thing. Well, so what's going to take place here? Look a little bit further. Then the men of the city said unto Joash, of course that's Gideon's father, bring out thy son that he may die. This was under threat of death, because he hath cast down the altar of Baal, and because he hath cut down the grove that was by it. And Joash said unto all that stood against him, Will you plead for Baal? Will you save him? He's talking about, will you save Baal? What kind of God do you have? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death while it is yet morning. If he be a God, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar. Therefore that day, let me get to verse 32. Therefore on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal plead against him. And that's almost exactly what that name means. Let Baal plead, because he hath thrown down his altar. Now, when you begin to look at this and see it, and we'll try to cut it off right here and come back and finish up this whole section next week. But in the casting down, these men are ready to kill Gideon. They're supposed to be worshipers of Jehovah. They're supposed to be worshipers of a jealous God who will not tolerate the things, and yet they're going to threaten the death penalty on Gideon. They should be threatened with the death penalty. And yet they're not. What we see is the men noticed what was happening, and they considered it to be sacrilege. What they were doing was sacrilege. The men of the city discovered that it was Gideon, and he became their focus of anger. In fact, you have to understand that any time that you disrupt the thing that people love, they're going to be angry with you. Now, why do I say that? Because anytime you start preaching against something, and people love that something, but it's sin, they will hate you. They would rather seek your death than to lose what they love. That's why the men of the city determined, verse 30, that Gideon must die. But Joash is very firm. Now remember, Joash seems to be experiencing a revival. Joash, it was on his property, and all of a sudden he's defending his son. Let Baal kill him if he can do it. Joash is exposing the impotence of the god Baal. He says it to me in a mocking tone. And he even says basically, give Baal until tomorrow to avenge this deed. And that's the tone that leads to this new nickname. That apparently Gideon, in his act, inspires his own father to step up and return to Jehovah in spite of the crowd that was angry at him. And Gideon's new name is Jerubbaal. Let the false god plead for himself. Oh, unless he can't. Maybe this is the beginning of a revival. Maybe again, this is where the heads are starting to turn. These same men that are now calling for Gideon's death are being stunned by Gideon's father, and something is also taking place to them. That when Gideon calls for men to fight and line up for the fight, they're first in line. A revival is taking place. We'll stop there and look, because I should give you at least one more verse, because the next verse that kind of gets me. As soon as revival starts, what usually happens? Trouble starts happening, doesn't it? Looks like revival's happening. Gideon's father has turned. The men are going to turn. Something's happening. And what takes place in the very next verse? Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the children of East were gathered together and went over and pitched in the valley of Jezreel. How interesting. A huge army, well equipped, able to remember all the camels that are supposed to be there. And that is what really strikes at the heart of these men and Gideon when they are supposed to be getting ready to do battle. When they're supposed to be getting ready to follow after God. Remember, God had already told him, I'm going to use you to save Israel from the Midianites, and you're going to strike them dead as with one hand. Revival starts, it's getting excited. Maybe things are going to build up, and the army gathers, and look at how outnumbered they are. Look at how outarmed they are. Folks, it happens to us. It will happen to us. When revival starts, the devil's going to try to get in and cause problems. It happens every time. The devil is as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And he's not going to sit quiet when revival begins to happen in one of the Lord's churches. I am going to quit there, and we'll come back to it and start in this same verse.